Hey everybody, it's Patrick Lovell coming at you at about 1 p.m. my time on Monday, October 3rd, and 2022. And yet another somewhat nauseating, revealing, crazy, sort of stuff that has transpired from last night through today. And it's really more of the same of what I've been preaching, educating, enlightening, invigorating, hopefully battling with you on an ongoing basis. It's a crazy, crazy, crazy situation. Um, so as of last night, the first thing that had a lot of people talking was what looked like potentially the insolvency of one of the biggest banks in the world, a too big to fail bank that's located in Switzerland, that's part of the coveted too big to fail banks that are involved with all sorts of crazy uh, criminal stuff. I mean, some horrifically criminal stuff. But they looked like they were going to be insolvent as part of this ongoing scenario that kind of morphed out of England with the Bank of England, the Central Bank of England, having to step in and provide liquidity and buying bonds to save pensions, but also doing a lot of fiscal austerity while reducing taxes for the wealthiest in the United Kingdom to try to, supposedly deal with rising costs of inflation. And it gets a little bit complicated. In fact, I don't have anywhere near the intelligence and the tech, really the know-how to understand, to unpack all of the sorts of ways interest rates with derivatives uh, on an overnight lending basis can lead to like really short liquidity traps that could potentially create all sorts of systemic problems in our financial system. But all of that is a continuation of what it is that I am an expert in, that has done what nobody else has done, that basically, it doesn't basically, it's just remarkable that we have presented what created the great financial crisis in 2008, led to millions of people getting completely set up and destroyed by our system, which includes the judiciary, to basically not just gut the middle class or the American dream. And what I mean by the American dream is not just the economics of the middle class, but also the integrity of law and the common sense of supply and demand and everything that supposedly runs free markets. But what I've been telling you for a very long time is that's not how it works. And the only ones, pardon me, who have been able to go to the distance to be able to show you exactly the mechanics of how it works is what we put in the con at www.thecon.tv. And the entire purpose of that was to get you and to elevate the truth of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that was made possible by what has become the power of the world ever since. The Federal Reserve is in the intersection of it all. So when there was a lot of scuttlebutt last night talking about uh, bank, uh, you know, Bank Suisse being potentially insolvent, and a lot of sell-offs and a lot of dramatic concern about these derivatives and how it was creating kind of what they call a Lehman moment that could basically cascade and create problems for other central banks in Europe. One of the largest being Deutsche Bank, which of course many of you might recognize from being involved with Trump. But they're up there with Citigroup and Chase, and they're one of the world's largest banks. And so if there's a liquidity crisis again, uh, it could create a global downturn and calamity and all sorts of scenarios that create what would be another global depression, which at this stage of the game, considering all the things that are happening in politics, could be extremely problematic. Not to mention what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, it's a very, very volatile world at the moment, and the financial system is really the creation of all of it, if you want to know the truth. So, what happened and what continues to happen, and how does it continue to be relatable to all of the information that we've provided to you that the entire world is missing? Okay? Not the entire world. There's a lot of people that are getting more and more astute and on point about what the Fed has been doing and what it does and how it does it to become something that's really raising on their radars from their particular come froms of like, you got to be kidding me. but they still don't have the facts of what we put in the con. And this is why it's so important. And I want to kind of take a different track here. So it appears that the Federal Reserve has, in its kind of bailiwick, ability to create different infusions in a different quarter that can potentially create all sorts of, lender of last resort capacity and bond purchasing sorts of programs, which we call QE. Um, you know, Given what they've been trying to do over the course of the last several months, which is increase interest rates and decrease the amount of quantitative easing or create what they call quantitative tightening to where they're not purchasing bonds and providing liquidity in banks to purchase their bonds however they created those bonds to prop up the stock market. And this is what's been going on for the last 10 years. And so what happened today is it looked like it was a crisis that could create a domino and completely, have another 2008 event, which a lot of us have been thinking is inevitable, right? And I've been thinking that way for like the last 18 months, but they continue to be able to kick the ball down the road because the Fed continues to do what it does because you don't understand what it does, because no one in media is going to tell you what it does. No one in media knows exactly what they're talking about, and yet they get paid $30 million to cherry pick other events that are situations to keep our attention focused on everything but what absolutely has control, which is the financial system and the global financial system. And the way they've worked and operated is every time they save the banks and they save this situation, this racket, they just destroy the free markets that much more. And so that it's just more and more money to the most wealthy companies in the world, as well as the most wealthy people associated with those companies. It's a nonstop looting scenario from these central bank antics through a whole smoke and mirrors menagerie to make you think that, hey, they're going to save pensions, they're going to save the economy. Whatever's happening right now with inflation, whatever's happening with houses being out of reach for me, whatever's happening with me not being able to make more money is suddenly going to equate to, if they continue with interest rate hikes, most of you, most of us, not having the opportunity for income. They're going to create more unemployment. And usually, how that works is those who are the most vulnerable at the bottom are the ones who feel the pain and suffering first. And if there's no bailout, for example, for the people, and to put this into context, because of what QE has done since 2020, we've seen $3,000 land in the lower 50% bank accounts. And by comparison, over $900,000 in the bank accounts of the 1%. That's just one aspect of this. Can you do the math? What's the difference between $900,000 and $3,000 as it spreads out? And so ultimately, because of easy money lending practices throughout this whole situation, those that are in power are like, whoa, 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 Nelly, we got to hit the brakes on what we've created that's supposedly creating inflation. And they're blaming people by saying regular people that have gotten jobs since COVID and markets open back up or the economy opened back up, that you're getting paid too much money, that too many of you have jobs because you have too much money, because you have more spending capacity, that you are creating conflation. And so therefore, we got to put the skids on this and slow things down. Meanwhile, what you don't know is this incredible apparatus of the system that is so incredibly sophisticated at grifting its way to the outcome of what I just told you, that the rich get exponentially richer while everybody else falls and falls and falls. They're at this kind of crux right now, i.e., the financial system of the world, where you can't continue to create and pump money into these markets and not expect inflation to continue to soar, while at the same time trying to maintain full employment and trying to maintain buying capacity for the people below the line. But that's where the whole facade is. They don't care about the people below the line. The suffering, the expendability, everybody down here, they get to be thrown in the trash. And that creates all sorts of incredibly painful scenarios for people that, loss of income, can't afford to pay the rent or the house or to maintain the family and so on and so forth. And so you have just incredible cultural despair. And like, for example, the way that, and I don't really talk about this often, but the way it impacted me was that when I first went through this situation in 2008, I was making great money. I was into my house. I had a young family and I was living my dream, right? I'm the kind of guy that, ended up coaching football, being very involved with my kid's life, a guy that provided for the family and was kind of an upwardly mobile middle class guy. And that's how I operate. And suddenly my world turned upside down because of the situation that I'm talking about. And it took me over a decade to go get all of the answers that I'm telling you about. But back in the old days, in my life, back in 2008, what it led me to was initially insanity because I didn't understand it, which led me to want to ultimately, end my life because I couldn't handle the pressure or the failure or the sorrow of not being able to be, you know, uh, uh, the breadwinner, the provider for my family, and a safety net, and somebody responsible and accountable, based on the decisions that I've made, which came from getting a college education, working my ass off to get into a position that I could be independent, only to have basically my world turned upside down. So what I ended up doing was I went on this incredible journey to answer all of the pieces of the puzzle that I knew that the mainstream wasn't answering. The media, our government, everybody else. It felt to me like they were hiding something. And as it turns out, they were. So what you need to understand, and before I get there, I want to go into the second aspect of this. Look, in 2020, all right, so 2008 is its own standalone, but it created because of this incredible criminal syndicate that blew up the world based on everything we show you on the con at www.thecon.tv, led to the Federal Reserve providing $30 trillion dollars of liquidity to a criminal system illegally behind, in the back rooms that nobody understood and nobody questioned. And as it turns out, like I said, it was illegal. And I could go off on a tangent all day about what that illegal scenario was, but just suffice to say, all of the financial, the too big to fail banks, the hedge funds, the private equity, everybody who's immersed in making money from money through this whole complicated flow of capital, ultimately got bailed out when they buried everybody else. And that led to all sorts of political upheaval. On the left, it was the Occupy Wall Street movement. On the right, it was the Tea Party. And that created this world that we've got into. But starting in 2010, we created what was known as quantitative easing. And quantitative easing is just simply the Federal Reserve can say to primary dealers, which are these huge, too big to fail banks, okay, let's come up with a price for what bonds you want to sell. And they could be mortgage-backed securities. They could be all sorts of different sorts of packages they put together on consumer consumption, and then they just bought it at full value. So, like they said, let's meet on a price. Okay, let's say too big to fail bank A says, look, I've got somewhere in the vicinity of $26 billion of these mortgage-backed securities that we all know just failed. We all know are worthless, but I'm going to sell them to you for $26 billion. And the Fed did that. And they did it over and over and over, and they never stopped doing it. They did it for the last 12 years, okay? And they continue to do it in ways that are just unbelievable. So, for example, in 2019, and nobody really understands this, there was another global run on derivatives that is part and parcel to this bullshit. Let's just call it a casino in terms of banks, trying to hyperinflate assets and everybody betting on the margins and finding ways to get fees and all of these things that don't produce money for the real economy. It went sideways in 2019. And if some of these groups that I pay attention to are correct, they said that the liquidity that was created in that crisis in 2019 was over $20 trillion. So we've got 29 trillion in 2009, another 20 trillion in 2019, and then we had the mother lode of them all. Literally, when COVID hit, the economy just went off a cliff. It just all came to a complete standstill. There was more people that became unemployed overnight. There was no business activity. Supply chains just shut down, and everything that came with it, and that manifested trillions of more of liquidity into the system, which ultimately created this hyper boom in stocks and this hyper boom in equities, which are stocks, and hyper boom in real estate. Even though nobody's buying houses because nobody's got a job, but meanwhile, the people who have all the money are buying assets because that's what we do. we give money to the richest people in the world, really, to prop up what appears to be an economy. Meanwhile, everybody's fucking falling through the cracks. So, for example, again, to remind you where we are in the conversation, and because of quantitative easing in 2020, the lower 50% of all households received somewhere in the vicinity of about a $3,000 increase in their bank accounts. By comparison, the top 1% got $900,000 in that same time period, based on all of these things that play out in increasing value of equities and stocks and real estate and that sort of thing. So now we're a couple of years out from that, right? The economy's starting to maneuver. People started to going back to work. The Fed was supposedly, because the economies of the world were starting to come back after COVID, we're going to start to pull back on the easy money lending process to the banks and to the financial system that can play this casino in every which way that they can make money going up and money going down in monumental ways, just as long as that spigot to the Fed is still open for easy money. But once they increase interest rates, and once they pull back on the asset buying program, then everybody in that financial system that's been creating this illusion ever since, they pull back. What they do is they're like, nobody's buying, we're going to back up, and then all of a sudden the entire system seizes up. Again, capital is fuel for the markets, just like oil in your engine, right? Gasoline in your engine. It's what makes it run. But imagine that, this whole time we've predicated this whole thing on whatever is going to be the fuel injection, and then the people that are supposed to manage it literally only manage it for themselves, and they're going to pull back and they're going to let the whole engine collapse, because that's how they do it when you're insanely like a crack addict getting free money. Just imagine, and that's what they do. And I happened to see a report a couple of weeks ago that showed that a lot of these guys that had become these huge asset managers were spending shit tons of money on strippers, which made me laugh, right? But that's kind of the perverse insanity of all of these types of things that have been going on for like the last 20, 30 years, okay? But on overdrive, in fact, let me just clarify that what I just said. The first time this ever happened in history was because of what happened after the great financial crisis, which we show you completely in the con, that created this world, that created this illusion, that creates this madness. And so today, as it appears at the moment, let's take a look at where the market is at the moment. Booming, almost 1,000 points up in the Dow, almost 500 points up in the New York Stock Exchange, and NASDAQ is way up as well. So it's a good day for people that are invested, okay, because of this policy. But most people that are invested in markets and have equities and all of these things are the top percentage of the population. Meanwhile, if the Federal Reserve goes through, no matter what, and I don't think they're going to, because I think the liquidity that just provided today to try to stem off whatever this is could be just another Band-Aid, or they'll continue, being able to move this forward. I still haven't figured it out yet, because I know that the Federal Reserve has a plunge protection team and all sorts of other complicated stuff. But meanwhile, if they do increase the interest rates, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. There's going to be a lot of suffering. So one way or the other, you have cost of living that goes up that you can't keep up with, or you're just going to suddenly lose your job and the ability to pay the debt that you've aggregated. And if you're doing that, that's kind of what I did back in 2007, because I was making a lot of money, and then I wasn't overnight, and then I lived on credit until I couldn't afford it anymore. Then the entire economy collapsed. I think that's what we're right in the midst of. And what it did to me initially, like I told you, was it drove me insane, almost drove me to kill myself. I finally got all the answers, only to go to 2020, and literally the same thing happened to me again. So on a personal level, I basically lost my marriage because of this. My son, very difficult times for him over the course of the last 3 years. Thank God he's starting to pull back out of it. But, the pressures are still there. My separated wife, she's bounced into action. She's actually doing pretty well right now, but we're separated. And, it's still a lot of pressure on us. We're not anywhere near where we used to be. But, I'm still trying to get this truth to the world of how this system works. And it's not an endeavor that pays money. But I do it because I have to, because I've got the truth that the goddamn world needs to come to understand if we have a chance to create or recreate the paradigm because we know how this whole thing works so that we can shift to a sustainable world and a sustainable economy to where we actually have a middle class and we have everything predicated on the rule of law and supply and demand and all of those things that I grew up thinking were the story. We've perverted this whole thing and we've distorted markets. And it's literally a house of cards and it's a giant grift and it's a machine of madness that will continue to loot the world until they blow themselves up or destroy all of us in the process. And the question is, if you were sitting knowing what I know, and for the millions of you who've experienced this, if you've had pressure in your life, you've lost your, your marriage, all the calamity that comes with it, and for all of you who have lost your houses, again, the only way that the courts could illegally foreclose on you was because of this system that I'm telling you. The money to be able to provide all of this stuff to the people that foreclosed on you illegally came from the Federal Reserve through quantitative easing. That's how they bulldozed everybody, and the whole thing is predicated on collateral. And so you were thrown into the streets and your lives were destroyed, and however you bounced through it, and many of you are still hanging on by your fingertips, but you're just looking at this small piece of the puzzle when what I'm telling you is this huge universal machine of deception that we all continue to just play along with. That's based on the full faith and credit of the United States. And what kills me is that I've always been about truth and honesty and courage and the strength of dignity. And I've always live and let live. It doesn't matter what your ideology is or how you live your life. Everybody has processes that they go through. But for me, when you live an honest life and you live a life with value and live a life of purpose to try to be that good guy, parent to, a kid to teach him how to live within the rules and do the right thing and everything else. And suddenly you realize and you look around and this whole system is a complete deception racket for criminals. And I can't sit on the sidelines and let that happen. I can't pretend like it doesn't exist. And I've literally sacrificed everything I am to be able to bring this truth to you. And the pressure is immense. And I promise you that if we don't do something about this together, collectively, with the truth, this thing will bury millions of more people. It could lead to a complete, wipeout. I don't know what to say about what's going on with Putin and what's going on with the ups and downs, the volatility of the markets, and then all of the other things that are associated with climate change and everything else. All of these things are fixable, but not when criminals are in control. And that's what I'm just trying to tell you. These criminals save themselves at your expense. They are above the law. They don't care about the law. In fact, for all of you who've lasted this long to listen to this, I'll give you a cultural reference. Today, Kim Kardashian got, I think, fined $1.2 million for deceptive acts and practices. Kim Kardashian gets a small fee for a small-time deal, just like Martha Stewart did when the Kings, Pierre Stephen Cohen and all of the other guys that Goldman and BlackRock and all the huge asset managers and private equity and all the rest of them, they're untouchable. The law is just for people down here. And like Kim Kardashian's down here, right? That should put it into perspective for you. It's all a game of absolutely monumental hide and seek. And they've got complete control based on just being able to control the central bank for themselves. Anyway, I hope I've connected with you. I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm trying to prevent the suffering of millions of people. And I know I said this a little bit, I don't know, tongue in cheek last week. And I said, how do you fix stupid? Suffering. Well, I've suffered enough. I don't want to suffer anymore. I want the world to make sense. If you want the world to make sense, you must understand how the world works. The easiest way to do that is the Con at www.thecon.tv and join us. We're trying to bring as much attention to this insanity as we can to elevate the truth above the sea of noise and lies. We live in a system where people can lie out of their ass and become absolutely insanely rich because you don't understand how it works.